Deer Hunter Podcast, a platform created to entertain, educate, and evolve the modern day deer hunter. I'd explained to you, I planned on having some show notes here. I had a notebook with some stuff written down on it, and it just 15 minutes ago got destroyed. I was coming up. What's the road that comes from the highway to here?
Is that Dunkel?
People travel pretty fast on it.
Yeah.
There's a corner a little bit east of here.
Yep.
A flock of baby geese ran out, and a guy in front of me locked his brakes up, and I locked mine up. There was nothing I could do. I smashed into the back of him hard.
Holy cow.
Grenaded basically I drive a Ram 1500, an older one, a 95 with the big steel bumper.
Oh.
Thank God he did not get hurt at all. And I told him, I said, in your scenario, it just would have registered in my brain to do the exact same thing, but it happened so fast there was nothing I could do. So his vehicle's close to totaled. I was going to put my truck up for sale tonight.
Oh.
And now my whole front end is just mangled.
Oh, no. I'm so sorry to hear that.
So the truck's screwed up. My water, it was hit hard enough where, luckily, I keep all that backpack that I have the whole podcast set up is waterproof.
Yeah.
It went flying off the seat, as did an Nalgene water bottle that hit the dash and exploded. Soaked the whole backpack and soaked my whole notepad, so all the ink's running off of it and there's water dripping off the thing. But luckily the pack is waterproof, otherwise podcast equipment might have been destroyed.
Oh my God.
So the police were nice enough to say, I told them my situation. I said, hey, I'm driving here from across the state. I have a meeting right down the street. And they said, go ahead, we'll contact you afterwards. No one's hurt. It didn't sound like anybody was going to get any kind of citation. It was a freak event. Baby geese survived.
Right.
But at the expense of a couple vehicles.
Well, I think the most important part is everybody's okay.
Everybody's okay.
But,
thank God. I was worried. It was a hard collision.
I feel like now the pressure's on. I got to really...
Now the pressure's on.
...perform a really great podcast to help and make this worthwhile.
Well, I wanted to share the story because I'm going to share the photos on my social media stuff, and I'll tell everybody they can get the full story on the episode of the podcast. I'm really glad that nobody got hurt because I've been in an accident similar to that in that pickup in an ice storm up in Gaylord in some black ice, and I hit a lady. There was just, it couldn't have been avoided, and she was not okay. She was in a smaller car. This guy was in an SUV, thankfully. Mm-hmm. But, nobody got hurt. I made it here on time, and now we're up and recording. So
I'm really sorry to hear that. That's terrible news, and hopefully it's not the only. Hopefully it's the only accident you're having here. Hopefully this conversation isn't going to turn into a wreck.
I feel like we're going to go in the right direction from here. The voice you're hearing is the voice of Chad Stewart. Your official title with the DNR, state of Michigan, the DNR is...
Yeah, the official title, I actually hate saying it because it sounds so uppity.
Okay.
It's just the way they classify us, but it's technically the Deer, Elk, and Moose Management Specialist.
Okay.
So basically, all I do is take the biological information for deer, elk management and try to transform it into regulatory items that move forward with hunting.
So when people ask what you do you say you're a biologist?
Yeah.
What do you? Yeah.
Well, it depends on the person who asks.
Okay.
Sometimes I avoid getting into the whole deer thing because sometimes deer can be really polarizing animal. So sometimes I just say I'm a wildlife biologist.
Okay.
Based on the feel or the perception that I'm getting from the person and whether or not I want to engage them in any sort of long-term discussion. Because usually if you say deer, there's usually a follow-up.
Yeah.
And most of the time there's some sort of criticism usually associated with it. I wish you guys would do this, or it's not like it used to be here. So if I don't feel like getting into it, I'm just, oh yeah, I work for the state as a wildlife biologist.
Okay, we're gonna get into all of that, but bring me and our listeners up to speed about how you, found yourself in this position.
Um, in with Michigan, there was a position that opened up. It was probably about 2.5 years ago at this point, and I had been managing deer down in the state of Indiana for about 8 years. So, when you think of Michigan and deer hunting, there's really no comparison. I mean, it's one of the like top states in the country. So, I kind of considered it, the major leagues,
Top state as far as the volume of people that engage in deer hunting.
Total number of people, overall, just general culture. We're everything kind of pales in comparison to Texas in terms of numbers, and that's just a size issue. But when you think of the history and culture and tradition associated with deer hunting, Michigan's right up there. We've got almost 600,000 deer hunters in the state right now, and they used to have over 1 million. So it's a big deal in Michigan. So, and not that it's not a big deal in Indiana, it's just a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
Indiana's the smallest state west of the Appalachian Mountain Range. So it's a tiny piece of the Midwest. Michigan, it's a big deal. So I felt like I kind of owed it to myself to try to put in an application. And in the fact that, they kind of tack on elk and moose management, which isn't a very big part of the job up here, but that was just sort of sweetened the pot and just sort of allowed me to expand my opportunities a little bit more. And I was fortunate enough to get it. So I've been here with the state for about 2.5 years.
Awesome. So far, what's your, I guess what's one of the, there's so many questions that I want to ask you. I'm trying to figure out how to format it all, but we just got the whitetail, what do you call it, like our 3-year plan essentially?
Yeah, so Michigan does their deer regulations on 3-year cycles.
Okay.
And the reason that they do that is basically because, we want to take a little bit of a break in between a regulation, in between a proposal that comes to sort of fruition, and give it the proper time to evaluate it. And 3 years is a pretty reasonable amount of time to see if a trend is emerging for whatever recommendation is brought forward. Because if you constantly keep cranking on dials for management each year, you're not going to be really able to fully evaluate what's happening. You want to try to maintain consistency as much as possible. And that's why we try to keep things stable for about 3 years. Now, that being said, I came up here in the middle of a 3-year cycle, and I don't think we've had quote unquote stabilized regs yet. We've always tweaked something for some other reason. It's usually a concerning issue that comes up. My first year, it was, some of the situation that was going on in the UP with the deer numbers being really low. So we sort of went out of cycle and make some changes up there. And in the second year was some of the CWD response changes since we found that. So we've been making some changes regardless. So the stabilized cycle is sort of a misnomer because it hasn't really been stable yet. But
Okay.
it does allow us an opportunity to sort of put some issues off to the side for a time and evaluate what's currently happening in the state.
I tried my damnedest to read through all the changes and stuff, but I've been so busy that I really just have not been able to. I've picked up bits and pieces of it, but what are the primary biggest changes that we're going to be seeing here from this throughout the state?
Honestly, some of them are still yet to be decided.
Okay.
So when we brought forward a comprehensive package of changes in May, there was a lot for the commissioners to take on. So I don't know if how familiar you are or how familiar the listeners are with how things are structured as far as how something actually becomes a regulation. So,
Not all that.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'll back up a little bit and just sort of explain that process. So, as a biologist in charge of like the deer program, I am responsible along with a team of others for putting together recommendations to move forward. And some of those recommendations are done sort of collaboratively through interacting with like field biologists in our agency.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are work together with stakeholders, other conservation organizations that, want to see something happen in a direction. And then, on small occasions, I actually have a bright idea and actually decide to try to do something on my own. But for the most part, we take these recommendations and put them in what's called a memo, and we bring it forward to a natural resources commission. And now this commission is sort of like our agency's governing body.
Okay.
So it's not that we just don't have an idea and come up with it and wave a magic wand and it happens.
Right.
It has to go through a process. And this panel of commissioners are appointed by the governor to take the information that we provide and incorporate it with typically public comments. So obviously, inevitably, whenever we come forward with a recommendation, some people are going to like it and some people are going to hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to present it in an unbiased format that shows, this is the biological reasoning behind why we're doing what we're doing. Although we can acknowledge that there are social components involved that people like or don't like. And ultimately, the commission has to decide whether or not to approve our recommendations or reject them. And sometimes they might actually change them a little bit. And that process is called, if you sort of classify it, we're considered, I'm considered a trust manager. So deer are a public trust, held in the public trust. They're owned by the people of Michigan. So we are responsible for managing that trust, and we're trust managers. And trust managers typically have the education and background to move forward with, hopefully responsible management of that
Right.
public trust. The trustees are typically appointed individuals. So the commissioners, our director, legislators, any that tend to get involved, they're trustees. So they're appointed or elected officials that tend to take that information as well as a bunch of other information and make the final decision.
Okay.
So a lot of pressure is really on them to make the decision. We just typically make the recommendation moving forward. So getting back to your original question, with the regulations, we brought it forward to the commissioners, and it was a lot. I mean, it was like an 80-page memo. And some of the items on there were fairly, I don't want to say controversial, but had a lot of interest from a lot of people.
Okay.
Specifically, antler point restrictions
Yep.
in the state.
Yep.
And what we call DMAPs, which are our Deer Management Assistance Permits. So those were actually split off from the original memo, and they'll be decided in July.
What's that? The DMAPs?
Yeah, DMAPs are, the acronym stands for Deer Management Assistance Permits. And what it is essentially a permit that a landowner can purchase who's experiencing damage, typically, during the hunting season.
Crop damage.
Crop damage, rubbing damage in certain areas. Yeah. So
Really?
Typically they're only for antlerless deer, but we have been working on a pilot up in the Northwest, 5 counties up in the Northwest, to allow them to take one antler deer because there's some rubbing going on associated with some orchard trees up there.
Yeah, I can attest to that because I grew up on a tree farm.
Sure.
And I've seen my grandpa be furious when you have this whole woods and a buck will come out and rub down a tree that he had tagged to sell.
Yeah, and it costs money and it can affect production.
Sure.
So, and the issue up there was because they were going through a process with mandatory antler point restrictions. sometimes you just couldn't hunt or shoot that animal during the hunting season that was doing some rubbing, because if he's not legal to be harvested, there's nothing you could do about it.
Right. I get that.
Yeah. So we allowed them to take one antler deer up in those 5 counties for the past couple years. But basically the landowner gets these permits, and then he can give them off to people to hunt on their property. So
Okay.
it's almost like a transferable tag.
I gotcha.
Yeah. And it's all done for the purpose of trying to reduce conflicts for agriculture, horticultural damage.
On a small local,
Yep.
very localized scale
Exactly.
to control population.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. Before we dive into the APR, because I know that's going to be an in-depth conversation, and there's a lot I want to touch on that. Is there anything else in the overall changes that are happening that stand out to you that maybe general people aren't aware of, or that you want to bring to the forefront? Things that need attention.
The biggest change is probably outside of APR, DMAP type stuff. Is probably some of the stuff we have with our CWD management.
Yeah, chronic wasting disease.
Chronic wasting disease is, CWD. We created a new surveillance zone up in southern Mecosta, northern Montcalm County, based on earlier this year we had a captive cervet owner submit a couple animals that wound up testing positive for CWD.
And this was what area?
Southern Mecosta, so it's sort of the northwest of Lansing area, maybe an hour or two away.
Okay.
Just sort of as you're it's sort of west of that Clare, Mount Pleasant.
A little bit of the
corridor.
middle of the state.
Yep. Yeah, sort of west central.
Okay. Touch on CWD real quick. I'm pretty well informed on it, but for anybody that's not, what it is and what it does and how it affects a deer herd.
Yeah. So CWD, chronic wasting disease, is a disease that affects the neurological system of members of the deer family. So whitetails are impacted, mule deer out west are impacted. You know, we've got elk and moose in the state. They could potentially be impacted. It affects all of them. They actually just found it, I think, last year in reindeer in Norway. So really almost any kind of deer species, it seemingly could be susceptible.
There's how many states in the United States? I mean, I know they're dealing with it on a high level in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
They've kind of been the guinea pig a lot for a lot of strategies, and I mean, they're at the forefront of dealing with it, right?
Yeah, Wisconsin sort of had the unfortunate designation of being the first state in the Midwest to discover CWD, and that was back in, I think, late 2001, 2002 timeframe. Prior to that, it was pretty much thought to be a Western deer disease.
Mm-hmm.
They knew it was out there in Colorado. They knew it was in Wyoming. I think it had maybe gotten in a little bit to Kansas or Nebraska, Utah area. But
Is it in Texas?
It is now.
That's what I thought.
Yep, it is now. That was just recently, probably within the past 3 to 4 years.
Man.
So it's now in, don't hold me to this, I want to say it's 21 states.
Wow.
In free-ranging deer, and you might add another 1 or 2 just in captive deer, and then it's in 2 provinces as well up in Canada. So it's spreading. It's probably in more states than that.
Just hasn't been identified yet.
Hasn't been picked up yet. Yeah, and that's part of the problem, identifying the disease. If you don't have deer that are tipping over because of the disease, because deer will die from it. It just takes time for them to die from it. Year and a half, 2 years after they become infected with the disease.
Yeah, explain how they do become affected. Because from my understanding, the disease can lay essentially on the ground for quite a long period of time before deer can pick it up, and then they have it for a long time, which gives them the ability to transmit it to a lot of animals.
Yeah, so the infectious agent of CWD is called a prion, and a prion is really a lot different than what you would normally think of something that makes you sick, like a bacteria or a virus. You know,
Mm-hmm.
those things are living organisms that eventually have a lifespan and die. You know, you can
Okay.
kill bacteria with antibiotics, right? And viruses sort of run their course in most cases. You know, prions aren't, you can't kill them because they're not alive. It's a protein, so it has no living pieces. It's just a biological piece that's out
So
there.
it's like a piece of gravel just sitting on the essentially on the
Yeah,
ground.
yeah. I mean, but it obviously originates from an animal. You know,
Right.
it's a protein.
Right.
So these proteins, once they get into the animal's body, they match up with other proteins. And I mean, prions are in your body. These are misshapen proteins. So what they do is they latch onto the normal shaped proteins or prions, sort of serve as a template and misshapen them again, and then that's how it accumulates, and then they split off and go again. So what happens is it eventually works its way through the central nervous system and bores little holes in their brains. So, you know, one little hole in a brain in the right spot might not cause a problem, but once these holes start accumulating over time, you know, the animal loses its capacity to think or move or, you know, perform basic biological functions, and that's when it ultimately stops eating and starts exhibiting neurological symptoms, you know, where it's just waving its head and bouncing around and can't control its mouth anymore, so it's got drool dripping out of it.
Which is all contaminated,
Yep, yep. And these
potentially.
prions are shed into the environment through the saliva, through their urine, through their feces, and once they're there, they're extremely resistant to destruction. So
And
they,
on top of that too, after the deer passes, this those prions are still in the skeletal structure, if I'm correct, right?
yep.
So the carcass laying there is also infectious to other deer and
Yeah, no, the prions they've been found in skeletal muscle, but the highest densities are typically in like the brain, spinal column area, basically the part of the central nervous system.
right.
So we just that's one of the changes that we had um, in this last regulation cycle that was actually approved. You know, you can so now hunters in Michigan cannot go out of state to hunt deer, elk, moose, and bring the entire animal back in.
Right.
So that regulation was in place already if you hunted in a state that had CWD. You already couldn't do that. So if you go down to Missouri or out to Iowa, you know, you can't bring the whole animal back in and had to be.
Ohio. A lot of guys from Michigan traveling to Ohio to get a deer, and they cannot bring that.
They can't now. Ohio actually doesn't have CWD in its free ranging deer that they know of. So that's a really good example right there. Is we don't know if Ohio has CWD. They've never found
It's
it.
not confirmed.
That's right. Um, and so hunters still could go into Ohio or Indiana, shoot a deer and bring it right back, the entire animal, and process it themselves. Just, you know, save $80, $100, whatever. Throw it on their back 40 and let it go. And the animal could be healthy and be fine and nothing ever comes of it, or it could look healthy and have CWD.
Right.
And now you have a little contamination spot in your backyard, and that puts the entire localized deer herd at risk. And that sounds extreme, but the reason we have moved forward with this regulation is what came out of Arkansas about a year or two ago. So Arkansas found CWD after we found it back in 2015. It was like December of 2015. And once they started looking, you know, doing some sharpshooting testing, it was in like 20% of the animals that they tested.
Jeez.
It was everywhere. So, you know, before that, I don't think we had many Michigan hunters going to Arkansas, but a Michigan hunter could have gone to Arkansas, shot a deer in one of those CWD endemic areas where they're finding it, and brought the entire animal back in, and they'd have been completely legal to do that. So basically, we don't want to trust other states that they're doing enough sampling to say that they can confirm that CWD isn't in the state. So we need to take matters sort of into our own hands and try to protect our own
So
local
as of
herd.
now, to be legal, I have a close group of friends that are traveling to Ohio this year to deer hunt. So what is the protocol now for when you travel out of the state,
Yep.
and back to?
Yeah. So you go out of state, you have a great hunt, you shoot a nice deer. You can bring back. You can obviously bring back the antlers, whether they're just sawed off and you're gonna do an antler mount type somewhere, or you can bring the skull cap back as long as it's cleaned off of all sort of brain tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if you're just doing a skull cap mount, that's fine. If you're doing a sort of like a Euro mount or something like that, you basically have to. The animal's brain can't come back in.
You need to essentially locate a taxidermist there, or
For like a Euro mount, you can bring the stuff back. You can bring hides back. You can bring obviously your deboned meat back. You can actually bring
deboned meat.
deboned or quartered meat. So you can quarter the animal
Oh, it can't. Okay.
bring the legs, including the bones, back. So that's okay too.
Not the spinal column.
Not the spinal
That's
column.
what we're trying to avoid.
That's the kicker. Yeah. So if you have a taxidermist in Michigan that you want to use, you can still use them.
Right.
But you've got to go through the right processes to make sure that it's taken care of to get it back up here. So you don't necessarily have to use a taxidermist in Ohio. You just have to make sure you're only bringing the right stuff back up.
But if you want to bring the skull back, you essentially, I mean, for me personally, I would probably bring a pot and boil the thing and do the whole deal right then and there. That's how I would do it, but a lot of guys don't do that. So what's their move?
Yeah, no, and that's probably the best. And if you're gonna do like a bleach skull mount or a dip mount or something like that, you probably have to find someone local there because you got to get that brain tissue out of the cavity.
Right. But I know a lot of guys that plan on having shoulder mounts done. Their typical protocol is to cape the deer, and the whole head and brain and everything would still be intact. So what's their move?
Yeah, then they probably have to find someone a little bit more reputable down there and take their time to actually cape out the entire head.
Okay.
And that way they can bring it back up.
So they do. They basically, if you're planning on traveling out of state to hunt and you're planning on shooting a nice buck and having a shoulder mount, you should look into knowing somebody in the area that you can take that thing to and have it caped out professionally.
Yeah, you want it done really well. And we're going to try to, we've been talking about doing like an outreach type video to show the exact way to do it yourself if you want to do that.
That's a great idea.
And offer that service because we know let's face it, it's going to be inconvenient for a lot of people. It's really easy just to sort of, cape it out sort of rough and take the neck right off and leave everything else and bring it right back in.
Right.
But ultimately, we felt that it was important to move forward with this regulation.
It's because, a huge thing.
It's going to be inconvenient for someone, or I mean, literally probably hundreds of people.
Right.
But ultimately, we didn't feel like it was worth the risk. Our deer. I mean, we spent just since we've had CWD in 2 years. I think we're well over $1.5 million just trying to manage this thing and do surveillance
and it's still all over the country going in the wrong direction, right?
Yeah.
And there's limited funding on everybody's end to try to deal with it, and it's just real tough with the shelf life that it carries and how much contact the animal comes into once it's affected.
Yeah, and that's and we get a lot. This is one of those freight trains that you're not going to be able to stop. So why are you putting so much effort and time into it? And ultimately, my answer is some of the data that's coming out of places like Wyoming that have been dealing with this for like 40 years is really scary. Like their deer numbers are down, their prevalence rates are really high.
Yeah.
Some of the scientific modeling that is basically being brought forward is basically saying that CWD levels at that high of a rate, and it's like 1 out of every 2 deer in certain areas have CWD. It's not, you can't have hunting and CWD at those rates and have a sustainable deer population.
It becomes a unsustainable entity where people aren't going to be able to get tags. You're not going to be able to. You need to protect what if you want to have the
Yeah.
ability to do that.
Yeah, there's parts of Wyoming that are pretty much closed to antlerless harvest because they simply can't support it.
Wow.
Some of the research has shown that those CWD positive animals are 3.5 times more likely to die over the course of a year than a non-CWD animal. So
In my own head, I'm thinking too in Michigan, where out west there's a lot of range. Deer, have a big habitat that they can occupy, whereas in the state of Michigan, we have smaller. I would say our herd is more concentrated. They live in
absolutely.
smaller woodlots and stuff,
Yep.
so it's essentially something that in my head I'm thinking it could spread even faster here.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's why places like Wyoming, some of these places, you're talking about like 10 deer per square mile. I mean, it's really low because the range is not great, or it's mostly in mule deer, which don't have the whitetail densities that
Yeah,
we see
whereas in
anyway.
Wisconsin, I've heard numbers 50 deer per square mile
Yeah,
in some areas.
probably higher than that in certain areas. Yeah, so you fully anticipate that once you get into, you know, dense whitetail areas in the Midwest or Northeast, that the disease would spread a lot faster than what would happen out west.
Essentially like wildfire.
And that's exactly what's happening in Wisconsin. They're seeing exponential growth in this disease, and some of the numbers that come out show that they're not necessarily finding as many necessarily as many positives they have before, but they're sampling way less too. So
Right.
I think from a couple years ago they found just as many or slightly more positive animals with CWD, and they sampled like 10 times less than they did like back in 2002 or 2003. So from a prevalence standpoint, it's much higher. Um, yeah, it's kind of scary because it can have impacts, and we'll probably not see impacts in like yours or my generation. It's like future generations type thing. So, again, the reason to prevent it from getting that high is we don't know what's around the corner. We know people are trying to work on it, whether it's a vaccine or whatever. The bottom line is if you can keep CWD at bay longer or keep it low in your deer herd or in a localized area, if a magic pill or bullet ever comes up that does get rid of CWD, you actually be able to apply it to a localized deer herd, whether it's in a bait form or a dart form, whatever. Um, if it's across the entire state, good luck. Yeah, you're not going to do it.
Right.
So it's just trying to keep it at bay as long as you can.
Yeah, that all makes great sense. I know that, like you said, there's a lot of controversy around it because states are trying all different kinds of methods. I think in Wisconsin, they've even gone out and eradicated some parts of the herd, and then they get a lot of blowback from the deer hunting community saying, hey, now, thanks a lot. There's no deer here anymore for us. And a lot of people just don't really have the details on how detrimental it could be.
Yeah, it was tough. Wisconsin's approach. I mean, when they first found it, I don't think it was wrong to try to eradicate. The goal was to try to eradicate the disease, and to do that, you probably had to either knock the deer herd down really low or get rid of them completely. I don't know if they fully understood the transmission route like we do today. I mean, you're talking 15 years ago.
Certainly.
So science has advanced tremendously, and Wisconsin's a credit for that. They've learned so much about the disease. But when you tell people that you're going to try to eradicate the disease because it's bad, and then you don't see any progress, that you're testing, you're finding the same amount positive as you were before, and now there's way fewer deer. People lose faith in that,
Right.
and that's understandable. So I think what you see now are states sort of shifting a little bit, and they don't really throw out the word eradicate anymore because,
Yeah.
like you said, it's in the soil. Like it's pretty hard to get rid of.
Right.
It's always going to be there. If you can keep it at low concentrations, maybe, just maybe, you can prevent another deer from picking it up. I don't
So it has
know.
no shelf life?
They haven't found it yet.
Wow.
They haven't found it yet.
That's scary.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a longer shelf life that they just haven't figured out yet, but it's not been. They haven't been able to put a cap on it yet.
In your opinion, what's are we doing what we can here, or is there some other things? What's kind of I know obviously finances, funding is a major issue. There's only X amount of dollars to throw at stuff, right? From your perspective.
Yeah. No, I think we're doing as good a job as we can. We've we've brought in sharpshooters in some of these areas that have CWD, and they're really good, and they've removed a lot of deer. And obviously some of them have been positive. And these are in areas largely that are pretty urbanized. So you're not going to get a whole lot of hunting anyway going on in some of these areas. I mean, these mostly where we're finding CWD is in these little neighborhood areas just outside of Hazlet, which is not too far from where we're talking right now.
Right.
So we've developed actually a really good working relationship with Meridian Township, which is sort of the governing body over
Mm-hmm.
Hazlet, and we've got these shooters in some of these public parks and have been able to remove quite a few deer. Again, we're pretty fortunate that Meridian Township, prior to this, had a urban archery program.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been able to sort of follow up with some of those archers and
Oh,
inform them about the disease and the importance of going out and harvesting deer. And certainly those guys don't see as many deer as they did before we had CWD because of our management strategy.
yeah.
But they're still having, I mean, there's still a lot of success. Last year they took 60, 70 deer between, probably about almost 100 guys. So,
Really.
yeah.
What protocol is in place for captive deer? Because I know captive deer get moved around, right?
Yeah. And the captive deer in Michigan are managed by our Department of Agriculture. So
Okay, so they're not managed by the Department
it's
of Natural
it's a
Resources.
little bit different. Yeah. Now we do have some role to play. We go out and do fence checks and assist with audits and stuff like that. Um, but ultimately it's sort of held under the management and guidelines of the Department of Agriculture. So we try to work really closely with them on captive cervid stuff. And again, we're really fortunate that we've got individuals in our agency that's really their full-time job to be liaisons between the captive cervid industry and Department of Agriculture, and they're obviously outstanding at their job. So,
Right.
but it's a common threat for both the captive industry and the free ranging deer herd.
Right.
Nobody wants CWD anywhere where they either own deer or hunt deer. So I think we have that in common, and I think we try to work together to make sure that there's minimal risk associated with it.
Right. From my understanding, they can't confirm that CWD can be transferred to a human, correct? So say I shoot a deer, it's infected, I hadn't had it tested. From what I've gathered, it can't be transmitted to humans.
That's the current knowledge base that we have right now. Certainly, we don't recommend you eat a sick deer, and that goes anything beyond, even beyond CWD.
Right.
There's some interesting stuff that it's actually, I'm not even sure if it's published yet, but it was just presented somewhere at a conference over in, I think it was either Scotland or England, where they were feeding infected, CWD infected either venison or meat basically to some macaques. And macaques are, basically monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those animals were coming up positive for CWD.
Really?
So there is again some concern there. So yeah, no humans never, we've not proven that link yet, but I always say, or how do I say it? Absence of proof is not proof of absence.
Yeah, you don't want to be the one to be the
You,
subject in the doctor's room saying you got chronic wasting.
you don't want to be the person that someone's writing a paper about in New England Journal of Medicine.
Right.
Yeah, so we try to have a lot of outreach and communication efforts on just trying to be knowledgeable. If you're hunting in an area with CWD or if it's a concern to you, bring your animal in and get it tested. And that way you have a pretty good idea what's going on with it.
What about livestock?
Right now it's just a deer-only disease. So they've done studies out in, I think it's Colorado, where they have a bunch of CWD infected deer, and they share a common fence with cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And as the deer keep getting sick and tipping over and bringing in new deer, cattle just keep moving along and being fine with it.
Okay.
So cattle have their own sort of what's called a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, which is the family of disease these are in, and that's called mad cow disease. And obviously that has been proven to have a link with humans back in the UK in the 90s.
Right.
But they've not proven that link yet for CWD, and they've not been able to get CWD into cattle.
Okay. All right. Well, we got a lot of stuff to cover. Let's move off CWD, but not fully out of the disease. Is there any other diseases or anything that the deer are facing right now that are issues?
Well, that's a big one. I mean, in Michigan, we've been fighting bovine tuberculosis in the Northeast for, almost 30 years, I think now.
Right.
So that's a big one, and that's a critical one actually, because that is one that can get in obviously to livestock.
Right.
Cattle. It's a huge deal for cattle, and the industry surrounding cattle. It can get into people. It's treatable, but you don't want it. So that's another problem. That's a problem area, and we've got TB management zones up in the Northeast just for that. And the ticket for TB. So TB is a bacteria.
Okay.
So it is treatable, but the problem is when you get it at really low levels, it can stay in that deer herd and can be sustained in the deer herd. And again, without dropping the deer herd to pretty low levels for a fairly long period of time, you're probably not going to eradicate the disease. And that's pretty much what we're seeing. We've knocked it back from when we first found it. It was first in like 4 or 5% of the deer herd in that 452 area, which is the core.
Yep, that's where I hunt.
Really?
I spend a lot of time hunting in that area.
It's down to about 2% now.
Okay.
So it's better, but it's basically been plateaued for years.
Mm-hmm.
So we've not really been able to make any progress, and that's because we can't knock the deer herd low enough to really start seeing appreciable gains on that front.
And transmission of that is primarily from, is it from saliva as well?
Yep, it's mostly a saliva thing. Sharing common feed sources. Deer are social animals, so
Big time.
If one animal gets it, there's a good chance that another animal in that social group is going to get it too.
Right.
They're constantly grooming each other, so.
Right. And here in the state of Michigan, baiting is legal, but in that area up there, there's restrictions and some areas that no baiting at all due to trying to reduce the...
Yeah. There's 4 counties up there. That's Alpena, Alcona, Oscoda, and I think Montmorency. Those 4 counties that sort of touch 452, you can't bait. And that was actually one of the regulations that we brought forward, is to try to get rid of baiting in Presque County and Iosco County, which is the remaining 2 counties in what we call 487, the bigger TB management unit. And actually the commissioners did not move forward with that, so they'll still be able to bait in Presque and Iosco this year.
Mineral supplement in this state is that's something that a lot of guys like to put out for like trail cameras and things like that.
Sure.
It's, to my understanding, not legal until, is it legal through the season but not legal through the rest of the year?
It's considered bait. So once you're in hunting season, it's considered baiting, and we've got regulations that apply for that.
Okay.
Once you're out of season, it's kind of considered feeding. So there's restrictions on that. Like you have to be within, I think it's 100 yards of a dwelling. So it's strictly for recreational feeding. So to go out to your deep in the woods hunting spot and put a mineral block out there, that's considered that would be considered feeding, and that's out of season. That's not legal.
Right.
It has to be done for the purpose of viewing. Once it's in season, you're allowed to do that, though.
Minerals, something I want to pick your brain on it just because it's something that I recently have been reading about and talking to a lot of people that make mineral and sell mineral. Is that something that is beneficial? I mean, from my understanding, a lot of it is salt just with labels on it. But to your knowledge, is it something that can be beneficial, or is it just kind of a thing that the hunting industry uses to make some money?
Um, no, I think there is benefits to it, and I think most of the people that, and when I say benefits, I'm not talking about it's going to give them immunity to diseases and healthier. I mean, I think that's a crock, and I've heard that that
Oh, yeah.
these
Have a
animals
healthier deer herd.
these animals will be healthier and therefore more resistant to CWD.
There's some brands that very much, that's like their punchline is that you'll have a healthier deer herd to
Well, that's a
avoid.
line of shit. There
Awesome.
that's complete junk. In terms of those minerals putting on more antler growth, I think that can happen. I think that does happen. Do I think it's more important to have a really good mineral sites established compared to high quality habitat? Not a chance.
Not even close.
Not a chance. Yeah. Bottom line is, deer have been on this earth for, tens of thousands of years. And ultimately, if there's a problem with their numbers, generally it's habitat related. And that goes to meeting their cover needs, meeting their food needs, whatever.
Right.
If you're not seeing fawns in the summertime or in the fall and you think you have a coyote problem, you might, but it's probably because you don't have really great habitat.
Right.
If you're not seeing some of the size deer that you really want to see, it's because they're either not getting the age on them, or again, you don't have the great habitat.
Right.
It's not because genetics are flawed or anything like that. There's a lot of things out there that people look for excuses on why the deer herd isn't what they want to see, but the bottom line in most cases, 90% of the cases, is because the habitat is either subpar or they haven't done the work to do it. I get stuff all the time from people saying, I've been hunting this same stand for 30 years. And I just don't see the deer come through here like they did before. And it's like, maybe when you were hunting it 30 years ago, it was prime. You've got really early age successional type stuff coming up. You've got forage, you've got cover, you've got trails moving through, whatever.
Yeah.
Now it's developed into a more of an older age class, park-like, and deer just don't move that way.
Right.
So that's the first thing I do is, have you done anything with that spot in the past 30 years, or did you just let it mature and get too old and the deer have changed their travel patterns?
We're going to go right back to that. But
Sure.
before I forget about something, you just brought me into something that I want to talk about, and that is predation.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe it's different in the UP with bears, and we do have some wolves now in the upper, right? But before, well, I guess focusing on downstate, coyotes. There's been a lot. I've been reading a lot of the new consensus on how to deal with that issue, and I'd like to get your opinion about what kind of effect they do have on the deer herd and what we can or should be doing on it.
Yeah. So obviously coyote numbers are increasing, expanding, whatever you want to say. There's more of them, I think, and I'm not familiar with our fur bearer trends per se in the state. I talked with the biologist down in Indiana a little bit. Haven't explored it a whole lot because of so much of the time is based on chronic wasting disease up here since I got up here. But
Okay.
trends are for coyotes are not hurting. They're everywhere. They're extremely adaptable. They'll live right in the city. they're just everywhere. And yeah, they can actually have a pretty significant impact on some of the fawn recruitment that you see on your property, and that could be a problem if you're like a local manager trying to grow your deer herd. I mean, if you can't get next year's crop of fawns to get to the point where they're old enough to outrun or a coyote, you're not going to have many deer, or at least the number of deer that you want to see, right?
So in your opinion, what is the move for a guy that has a piece of property and he's seeing a lot of coyotes? What does he do to try to avoid?
So the thing with coyotes is generally the more you kill, the more you're going to have.
Yeah, they reproduce. It's a crate.
They come right back.
They actually recognize that they are being pressured and that their numbers are being reduced, and the mothers will have bigger litters of pups, and they recognize that in their social group that they're shrinking, and they will increase their litter size.
Yeah, deer are generally the same way. You know, when does are nutritionally stressed, you know, they'll only have typically one fetus and raise that one fawn, or they'll have two fetuses but one won't make it or be reabsorbed or something, and they'll have one fawn. But when things are prime and they're coming through the winter and they're in great shape, you know, that's when they can have two or three. So it's called density dependent.
Okay.
Dependence. Yeah. So I know there's a lot of information out now about, you know, trapping and, you know, trying to put impacts on predators, and I don't want to discredit that. I think there's probably some value in that, absolutely. But again, I bring it right back to habitat. You know, deer have been living with coyotes for thousands of years, you know, maybe not in the same numbers and proportions and ratios that we have in the past, but they've still lived it, and they've evolved techniques to avoid predation for the most part.
Right.
You know, I mean, you look at a fawn, and that one job of that fawn for the first couple weeks of its life is to hide.
Right.
Because it's not fast enough to outrun a coyote. So, you know, Mother Nature's given it the tools that it needs. It's got the spots to sort of blend into the to the forest floor. It's basically scent free. So that's really the sole purpose, is to avoid coyotes and wolves and bears, you know, things that are going to sniff it out and eat it.
Right.
So the better habitat that you can provide and areas for these fawns to hide in, the better chance you're going to have at recruiting those fawns. I was part of it, you know, when I was really young, actually right out of college, I got to work with a grad student in some of these forest preserves of Chicago. And Chicago has a mess of deer in some of these forest preserves.
I've lived there.
Yep. They're just everywhere in some of these places. And one of the parks, or one of the park areas that we went to, they have so many deer that they were literally eating themselves out of cover. I mean, you can go out there with a spotlight and see 150 yards out, pick up eye shine. It was like a manicured forest.
Really?
Yeah. And it was really easy to find fawns.
Oh man.
Because you're just hitting them with a spotlight and you can just see their eyes glow.
Right.
And you know, it's a fawn, so you just kind of sneak up on it and get it with a net and put a radio collar on it. Don't quote me on the numbers, but like 3 out of 4 of those fawns would wind up dying throughout the year.
Wow.
Over the next, you know, month or two, because they have no place to hide. I mean, we were finding them like literally under picnic tables. Like there's nothing. There's no structure whatsoever.
Right.
And the coyotes were just picking them up. I mean, if they stumble across it, it's like, oh, cool, there's a fawn. I'm going to eat that now.
Right.
And they weren't even eating the entire animal. You know, they would eat parts of it and then cache the rest of it. So no shortage of coyotes, but there was the fawns were dying like crazy. Other parts of Chicago, we really had to work hard for it. I mean, you couldn't spotlight hardly at all because the vegetation was so thick. So you basically had to get shoulder to shoulder with someone and start doing path swipes across the fields, across the forest, and then you kind of kick one up or you stumble across it, and that's how you get it. Those guys almost universally live throughout into the fall.
Okay.
Again, it's all habitat.
Right. It is
all habitat.
From my understanding, from what I've read and listened to, is that once you do have coyotes, you have coyotes. There's no getting rid of them. And you were saying coyotes and deer have lived together, for a long stretch of time. But coyotes are expanding to everywhere. So they initially, when they encountered deer, the deer numbers drop can drop pretty quickly because sometimes these deer just this is a new thing that they have are being a new predator, but they evolve pretty quickly to recognize how to avoid them and that the herd will reestablish itself, but that if you're going to try to do your part on your personal piece of property to manage coyote numbers, basically going out there if you're hunting and shooting one when it comes through or making it a point to go predator hunting with a rifle, you're basically not going to have an impact. From my understanding, the way to handle it is by trapping, and it's critical to do it right in the spring, right when the fawns drop, because almost instantaneously after you trap all those coyotes and remove them, new coyotes move in and inhabit that. So you need to do it when the fawns are.
Yeah.
If you're doing it in the winter, which unfortunately is when fur prices are high and guys do want to trap coyotes, come springtime, you may have little to no impact.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on with that, and I think there probably are some coyotes out there that might switch over a little bit. I mean, coyotes are opportunistic feeders, right?
Yes.
I mean, they'll eat whatever most of their diet is mice, small mammals, maybe some birds, insects. They'll just eat whatever. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some coyotes that have sort of developed this internal trigger to, like, you know what, I've caught fawns before, and I'm trying to, and they almost become specialists for a month or so out of the summer.
Okay.
I would not be surprised about that. Again, we were working on some fawn studies down in Indiana, and we're working through, and this is really good habitat, like really nice, hay fields and stuff that, provide a lot of cover for fawns. And we're finding pieces of fawns, and it's like, wow, this is something's really going on here. There's coyotes are really doing a number. And then we'll find like a live fawn, put a collar on it and let it go. And it's like, good luck, buddy.
Oh man.
there's bits and pieces of,
Yeah.
your brothers or sisters all over and within probably a week that animal's dead too. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some coyotes that sort of specialize and sort of switch over.
They
that.
evolve quickly as well.
I haven't seen that published, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that. And again, this was a 2-year study, and they were finding the same thing in those same fields every year.
Right.
So clearly a doe's going into that area, and it's just hiding her fawns there, and there must be a really savvy coyote that's hanging out in there.
My opinion on coyotes just in the last 6 months, just from actually really reading some of the new stuff that's been published, is I've probably done a 180 on what I thought about them and how you handle it and things. We have a private property up in northern Michigan.
Yep.
The neighbor's very serious about his deer management. He's at the highest level. And he is on a mission to kill every coyote that he possibly can. And I feel like he's wasting a little bit of time.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, and you said it. I think if you're gonna try to have an impact, trapping is really the only way to do it. And you want to try to protect the animals when they're most vulnerable. And that's in the summertime.
Right.
When the fawns are out there. Once they get a little bit older, unless they're sick or injured, for the most part, they can.
Yeah, pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, they can handle themselves. And I'm sure coyotes obviously still take down deer in the winter. I mean, it does happen. But,
right.
From a coyote standpoint, I mean, you're looking at a 30, maybe sometimes 50-pound animal, some of the bigger ones, but they're not. They got to think hard about going after a
right.
100-pound doe that's got some pretty wicked hooves on the end of her back legs.
Right.
I mean, one broken jaw, and that's a death sentence for that coyote. So
right.
they've got to really think about going after a bigger animal. They got to be pretty desperate. So that's why I think they're probably still focusing more on some of the smaller mammals at that time of year.
So trapping, and then that moves me right into the next thing I want to talk about is habitat. Whitetail habitat. Typical fawning areas are grasses, anywhere where you can at a waist level basically not see, right? A lot of thick undergrowth areas are fawning areas, thick grasses. So if somebody does have a piece of property and they want to try to reduce predation on their fawn herd, what is the move as far as habitat goes?
Just making some nasty areas basically. So so I think probably throughout most of the deer's range, probably the one thing that's probably most missing is some of that early successional habitat that they really need. And that's that combination of high grasses, smaller trees, shrubs, because they do tend to like, from a fawn standpoint, they tend to like some sort of vertical structure over them. It's not just getting in grass and kind of chilling out there. It's a lot of times bumping up against a log or a blowdown type thing and kind of getting in there a little bit.
Right.
Those are the successful ones that kind of get buried in like a tick somewhere and hang out there. That's probably what's needed. Trying to just build up as much of the understory as you can
For deer in general too, right? Not just fawns.
Absolutely.
New growth.
Yeah, it most of it comes to how much sun can you get to penetrate your woods.
Right.
That's gonna promote plant growth, and that's gonna either provide forage or cover for your deer.
Right.
It's not rocket science. It's just you get sun to the ground, things are gonna grow, and that's gonna be good for the deer.
We own a piece of private property up in northern Michigan. It's 120 acres, and I think we're going on 2 years ago. They were talking about doing some cutting in there. This particular piece that we own, my father owns it with, I believe, 4 other owners. They bought it a long time ago. They've had it for years. Most of it is mature poplar. Transitions into some swamps and stuff, but what they wanted to do was come in and cut all the poplar for the most part, and between the owners there was some discrepancies on whether or not they wanted this to happen. Well, for me personally, I've hunted there a long time, and my understanding of the benefits of this, it seemed like a no-brainer for me. They were going to get some cash coming in for having it cut. We were going to get tons of new successional growth, which was going to be huge for the whitetail habitat. It's very important for them because a mature woods with a high canopy with no low growth is very, very poor deer habitat, right?
Might as well be a desert. Yeah.
Yep. But it's pretty to look at.
Yeah. No.
So guys like it, and that's one of the things. They just don't want to see the change. You're used to sitting in this blind for 25 years. It's looked this way. You love it. You don't want to see somebody come through and cut it down, but it's critical to the wildlife.
Yeah, and
done correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fall victim to this sometimes myself too, just as a hunter, not even as a biologist, but you want to go to a place where you can see really well,
right,
and see really far.
Yeah.
And you go there, and you can see really far. Did you see anything today? Not a damn thing.
Right.
And then you sit there and think back. It's like, if I was an animal whose basically existence was to try to avoid a predator, I wouldn't want to walk through that
right.
space unless I absolutely had to.
Yeah.
So, and usually the animals that you see going through those spaces have been bumped or pressured from typically another hunter or something.
Right.
So yeah, it's not a natural corridor for them.
One of our neighbors up there, they had done the same thing a year prior, and so I wanted to talk with them and see how they felt about it after it was done. And he said it was the best thing we ever did. He said we've put in food plots, we've had nice blinds, we've done all this stuff to the property. You could have skipped all that. Cutting and having new growth they went from on average 3 deer a day sightings to 15 deer a day sightings, and it brought deer from neighboring properties into that habitat because they just preferred it so much.
Yeah, well, when you start getting into the fall and even winter, that's that's the critical stuff. That's the critical pieces for deer. They need that really coarse woody browse that's
It's like
available.
60% of their diet,
It's really
right?
high. Yeah, yeah, it's really high. They need that. So, you know, there's a lot of emphasis placed on food plots in the summer and mineral supplements and that sort of stuff, and that's great. I mean that happens, but especially when you start talking about Michigan and really northern Michigan, what you're trying to do is get that deer through the winter, and not only get them through the winter, but get them through the winter in good shape.
Right.
That's critical, and that's where we struggle sometimes with the UP.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little less in the northern lower. They don't have quite the severe winters that you see in the UP.
Right.
But the same sort of thing happens, because what happens is if that animal, even if it survives that winter, but it comes out of that winter really stressed, you're looking at a high chance of potentially abandonment with that fawn when that doe ultimately gives birth. And when you think about energy resources that a buck has, it's going to spend most of its calories to get its body back in physical condition, and the excess goes into the rack.
Right.
So when you think about like resource allocation on a personal level, and you want to shoot for a more mature, older age class deer, if that animal is nutritionally stressed, it's not going to grow the antlers that are desirable.
Right.
So the rack, the way I look at it is that's the surplus. Whatever that animal is taken in from the spring, summer, that's the surplus that's left that it can allocate toward growing antlers. If that animal takes a long time to get its protein, carbohydrates, minerals back up because it was depleted from the winter, it has longer to go to get to that point.
Right.
Before it can start allocating those resources into antler growth. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it absolutely does. And I've been just recently, and anybody that's listening should check it out. I believe it's Missouri Deer Lab. They just started, the University of Missouri has like a deer lab, and the professors there just started doing a podcast.
Mississippi State?
Mississippi State.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, no, Mississippi State, they've got some pretty incredible researchers down there.
They do.
I know some graduates from that school that are some top-notch folks. Yeah, no, a lot of it is dedicated towards, sort of the physiology of the deer and antler growth and stuff like that.
At a high scientific level.
Exactly.
It's been huge for me.
Yeah.
Like you were just talking about the woody brows. These guys have done now a couple episodes. I've listened to a couple hours worth of how critical that is and how you could focus your efforts on that, and it might be your best thing, versus going out and doing the food plots and the minerals and this and that. Just get out there with a chainsaw, cut some trees, do some hinge cutting, and give them the availability to have the food that they naturally want at their level, make it accessible for them.
Yeah. The trick is to know what you're doing with the chainsaw. Just like most certainly I couldn't go out and just throw seeds in and call it a food plot. It would come up terrible. I don't claim to have any sort of farming or green thumb whatsoever. Same sort of thing, it's best to sort of consult like a forester, so you've got a really good idea of what's going on, for the wildlife, but also for the forest itself. So
right.
that healthy forest is critical for wildlife populations.
Yeah, and you mentioned rack development, and so that'll bring me into back around to the APRs, the antler point restrictions. So much of deer hunting nowadays, it almost seems like guys don't even care about deer hunting. All they care about is antlers. They're antler hunting, which I get. It's a fascinating thing, and everybody wants to go out and shoot a big buck. But for me personally, just in the last couple of years, I've really started to enjoy just deer hunting overall more. But a lot of what's driving decisions and things around deer hunting now is what we call trophy class deer. Michigan has somewhat of a poor reputation throughout the country of not having a lot of big mature deer, probably primarily because of our hunter density, I'm assuming. But APRs are antler point restrictions. That is something that our state has been experimenting in smaller areas, not at a state level. And I know it was a hot topic, and it is a hot topic right now. So I'm limited on. I kind of have my opinion. I'm interested to get yours and what is going on in our state specifically with APRs right now, and how's it affecting. Let's hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, yeah. So there's no doubt that they're popular. The point of an APR antler point restriction is simply to get about one more year of growth on your bucks.
Mm-hmm.
It's to try to protect the way we have it set up in Michigan. You're trying to protect 50% of the yearling bucks.
Year and a half old.
Yep, year and a half old bucks. So
Which could be anywhere from a spike to an 8 point, correct?
depends where you're at. Yeah.
So APRs necessarily doesn't necessarily protect a yearling buck.
It depends on where you're at, and that again, it all comes back to habitat.
Right.
You pretty much need a 2 points to a side up in the UP. Again, not the greatest habitat up there. They're not gonna grow quite as big, especially in that first year. So a 2 point to a side is sufficient. You get down here in southern Michigan where you start getting into a lot more farmland, really mild winters. You don't have that winter deficit that they need to make up for. So you're starting at a surplus of nutrition already, and now
Right.
spring and summer hits, you're already piling it on. You get really good growth. So you need really four points to a side to protect 50%. And I say 4 points to a side. I think 4 points actually probably winds up protecting close to 2/3. Because a 3 points is slightly less than 50%. So you actually wind up protecting significantly more. But it's basically just to keep the yearlings off the minds of hunters for the most part.
Right.
And after 1 year, you're going to graduate a lot more animals. So from a management perspective, it's one of the most quickest things that you can do to get results.
Right.
The counterpoint, obviously, is everybody has different values in what they want to hunt.
Right.
Some people don't care if they are shooting
Some people are going out to get dinner.
Some people are going out to get dinner, and I would argue that even the guys that want to hunt under APRs are going out to get dinner.
Right. That's true.
They have different.
Yeah.
They have different motivations. They want to hunt a mature deer, but ultimately, they're going to fill their freezer too.
Right.
But some people don't have time to go out.
100%.
We talked with a lot of younger hunters this year for another survey, and they were largely, for the most part, supportive of APRs, but they sort of have acknowledged, you get just outside of college, you're sort of a young professional, or even in college, your time out is pretty limited.
Right.
People starting with young families, young kids, it's tough to get out. The guys that have no wife, no girlfriend, no boyfriend, I'll be politically correct, whatever, they have no significant other and can go out and do whatever they want. They're not limited on time, so they can be a little maybe afford to be a little bit more choosy on it.
Right.
People that have intensive jobs or commitments, or with family or professionally or whatever, they might only get out 2 times a year,
Right.
3 times a year, and if they're hunting in sort of a suboptimal spot and a spike buck walks up, that could be the difference between 70 pounds of meat for the year or nothing.
Right.
So I literally get both sides of the argument.
Right. And I do too, because I like to see bigger deer. I guess what I want to know is, does it have an effect scientifically on a deer herd overall, as far as like health, or because it's an unnatural thing in nature that we now have designated selectively which deer we are and aren't going to take. Does it have a positive or a negative repercussion as far as that goes?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kevin. You know, it depends on what your definition of, you know, uh, creating a healthy deer herd looks like. You know, if you're talking about keeping sustainable deer herd over the next however many years, deer are gonna breed. I mean, whether they're at what, you know, a year and a half or 2.5 or
Mm-hmm.
3.5, those does are gonna get bred. Even if there are literally no antlered bucks on the landscape, just male fawns, those does are gonna get bred.
Right.
It's not gonna be an optimal timing, but they're gonna get bred and they're gonna have fawns next year.
Right.
It's gonna happen. You know, there have been documented changes that sort of a top-down approach where you start having a few more mature bucks on the landscape can improve some of the timing of the rut, you know, improve some of the social structure that goes on.
Right.
So there is some benefit to that. You know, to say that the deer herd is going to collapse or continue to stagnate or something, if it doesn't happen, I think is a little erroneous. But
Right.
there can be some documented impacts from it, sure.
Yeah, it's definitely on everybody's mind. What can we do to have a higher class of deer? I mean, guys travel out of the state of Michigan all the time. I mean, a close group of my friends now are traveling to Ohio to deer hunt, because they want to shoot bigger class deer, and that seems to be the consensus from a lot of people, that that's one of the quickest ways, and I think you already said that, to do that is to have an APR.
Yeah, no, that would do it. You know, the places that people are going to tend not to have APRs. You know, Ohio doesn't have APRs. Indiana doesn't have APRs.
Just have low hunter density, and that's
Exactly.
not something that we're changing, right?
It's changing, but I mean, is that something that's good to change? You know, I mean, we're losing hunters. You know, 20 years ago we had 1 million hunters in
I've
Michigan.
heard that number's staggering, right?
It's
What
a-
is it?
We had well over 1 million hunters, probably
Yeah.
20 to 25 years ago.
And now?
I think we dipped under 600,000.
It's almost half.
We've lost. I don't know Ohio's numbers exactly, but we've easily lost the state of Indiana over the past 20
That's
years as far as
insane.
hunter numbers.
And
Easily.
that transitions into licenses that pay for everybody to be able to do the work to support the system.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, we sit there and talk about that. You know, our deer harvest, I mean, we used to harvest over 500,000 deer in the state, you know, back in the late 90s. You know, that was good that we were harvesting that many, but it was bad that we had a deer herd that was that high anyway to start with. You know, we're in the mid to upper 300s now as far as number of deer being killed in the state. If we keep losing hunters, and we're projected to lose hunters over the next
Oh man,
15 to 20 years, our projections are that we're probably going to be at around 500,000, maybe even a little bit below that. So we're going to keep losing hunters, and we've worked with demographers on this, and there's really nothing that we can do about it. You know, the problem is that some of those baby boomers that are like in their 50s and 60s, over the next 15 years, we're going to lose them.
right?
And we don't have enough of the teens, 20s, and 30s coming up behind them to fill that to make up for that difference.
Right.
So it's just, you know, when you have you almost think of our hunters as like a wildlife population.
Right.
When you lose the older age individuals and you don't have the younger ones to come up behind it, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Your population's going to fall.
Which means your whole system starts to fall apart.
Yeah. So
And then people are going to bitch because license costs have to go up.
Well,
or
like
do we have to find the money somewhere to
y-
continue to manage?
you think about some of the cascading impacts of that. We're gonna have to ask 500,000 hunters to take the same number of deer, if not more, that 650,000 hunters took 20 years before. So we're asking people to try to be more successful and trying to come up with ways to make them more successful. And I don't pretend to know what those answers are yet. But most of it revolves around doe populations.
Right.
So now you have to start getting creative with trying to get people to shoot additional does.
Right.
And that's sort of a cultural phenomenon that Michigan hunters tend to shoot more bucks than does.
I think, yeah, I don't know if it's, maybe you know that it's not necessarily just Michigan, or does that kind of carry through other states? I mean, the old timer, the stereotypical old timer who was pissed at you for shooting a doe. We don't shoot does on this property. I mean, we've kind of changed that. We've
Yeah.
seen shifts in that, but that's how it was for a long time. We don't
Yeah.
shoot does.
Yeah, and you can't blame those guys. Some of those guys grew up in an era where it was
Yeah.
hard to see a deer.
Right.
So you can't blame them, but that mindset does still persist. And I think it is changing as more research becomes sort of publicized about the impacts and benefits of shooting does, at least maintaining a more of a balanced harvest. But Michigan, man, I got to look at the numbers. Last year, it was like 55% of our harvest was bucks. And when I say bucks, I mean antler bucks.
Really?
When you factor in that you probably have another, I'm going to say anywhere between probably 8 and 12% of your antlerless harvest
Mm-hmm.
is button bucks. You're looking at well over 60% of our total harvest of deer have a penis. They're males.
Right.
That's probably not ideal. When I was down in Indiana, we would easily see antlerless harvest at about 1.5 times that of the buck harvest. The hunters down there have no problem shooting does. Same thing with Ohio. Ohio's data is really comparable to Indiana's.
Right.
They shoot a lot more, way more does than they do bucks. And again, that's a benefit for, again, that cascading impacts. That's a benefit for keeping your deer herd under control, which supports habitat, which in turn supports, the nutrition for the surrounding
Right.
and surviving animals. So there's some issues sort of on the horizon that eventually need to be changed up here, and change is hard.
Yeah, certainly.
Change
Yeah.
is really hard.
How do you get a guy that has limited time? A guy that works all week, he goes out on a Saturday. It's first thing in the morning. The last thing he wants to do is shoot a doe on a rut hunt when he
Right.
thinks that, potentially there could be a buck in tow or coming through in the next, half an hour. He just is not, there's like not a ton of motivation there to burn that tag in that situation.
Yeah, I think a couple managers now are trying to emphasize earlier harvest of antlerless deer.
Okay. Earlier, yeah.
October-ish,
Okay.
that's why you start seeing early antlerless firearm season start coming up in certain states.
Okay.
That's why you see some creativity with some license sales type stuff. Like when I was down in Indiana, we started selling what was called a combo tag.
Right.
Because prior to that, you were just buying season-specific tags. And what that does is simply promote season-specific purchasing. So,
Okay.
You buy your archery license, and if you're not successful shooting your buck, then you buy your firearms license like the day before firearms season. And if you're not successful, then you buy your muzzleloader license. What we did down there was create a combo license where you get a little bit of a discount. You get 3 tags, and they're good for any season.
Okay.
And by year 2, it was the #1 selling license down there. And we started seeing a lot more deer taken under those tags than we had previously. And I think the goal was people shell out whatever it is, 50, $60 for a couple tags. They want to fill them up.
Right.
They don't want to eat tag soup at the end.
No.
So Ohio experimented with some expiration dates on some of their antlerless licenses where, you buy it, I think it was at maybe even a discount, but that tag expires partway through the year. So again, it stimulates people to buy it at a discount and use it, because you can't view the doe as a booby prize anymore that you're going out in December and trying to shoot because you either weren't successful for your buck hunt or you just want to tack on a little bit more meat at the end. You're actively hunting does early in the season. And that has several benefits too. If you knock your doe herd down a little bit, you're probably going to have a really more intense rut, and again, that could have a benefits too from an enjoyment standpoint. So
and taking some stress off of food sources,
absolutely,
right? Because a big mature doe, not only do they consume food, but they will chase other deer right off of food. They will literally beat the hell out of them.
Oh yeah,
and protect that.
Yeah. Dominant animal usually on the landscape outside of the rut is going to be that old matriarch doe,
which is the funnest one. Shooting a mature buck is awesome, but man, if you're not shooting does, specifically going after some mature ones, I think you're just missing out, because that is a fun hunt for me.
It's one of the more challenging. I mean, if you specifically are out there trying to harvest, like say a 5.5-year-old doe, you're going to be frustrated more times than not, because they are pretty savvy.
100%.
They are keen, man. They are tough to get at. So
yeah,
that should be celebrated really as a trophy, and I don't think it is as much as it should be.
I know. Yeah, no, it's not everybody's after the big antlers, which I totally get. I am too. Not to sound like I'm against that in any way, shape, or form, but I just think some people are missing the bus about how much fun and the experience, of getting another deer and getting to do that more than once or twice a year. Take a couple doe.
Absolutely. I agree.
And hone your skills in as a hunter, especially early in the season. If it drives me crazy, these guys, they're new into hunting and they say, "Oh, I just want to hunt mature deer." Well, have you ever shot a deer before? No. And then they get an opportunity at a mature deer, and what do you know? I missed it, or I gut shot it. You've never shot a deer, and you think you're not going to be completely rattled or not know how to handle that adrenaline spike that you've never handled before if you've never tried to go out and start early in the season and get out there and get a couple deer under your belt and get used to controlling that. They call it buck fever, but it's a spike of adrenaline that goes through your body that a lot of people, it's hard to deal with. I've been deer hunting for 20 plus years and it's still tough for me. I feel I've figured out a way to kind of combat it, and one of those big parts is getting out in the woods early and getting a couple deer under my belt.
Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, you can't really practice for it either. There's a big difference between getting your bow out and shooting a target in July under virtually no pressure, and having a deer walk under your stand 20 yards away and kind of picks you up, and you're sort of at that crunch time moment. And you can't really practice for it. I'd be interested to hear some of your techniques.
Well, one thing is, there's a huge movement right now, especially for younger people, of incorporating fitness into deer hunting.
Yeah.
I'm on both sides of that, because you see guys at the gym posting pictures with these huge yoked up biceps, and it's trained to hunt, and it's like, having huge biceps is not going to help you kill a deer in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. However, when you do exercise and when you do lift weights, you get an adrenaline spike.
Yeah.
And it's not at the level that it is nearly as much when you get buck fever, but you're at least getting a little bit of an adrenaline spike. And when I do get that, I like to think about, processing that. And it's just something that your body otherwise isn't going to be getting. And so I think that's one thing for me, is that having my body be used to having a spike of adrenaline. And that's one way I can do it, is by getting a good hard workout in. And your neurological pathways just seem to work better when your body is experiencing something
Yeah.
not for the first time in a year's time. And so that's helped me out a little bit. And it seems kind of crazy, but I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Wim Hof.
No, that name doesn't
They
actually ring a
they
bell.
call him the Iceman, and I believe he's from Holland, over in Europe, and he has something along the lines of 26 world records of accomplishing these crazy feats of sustaining his body temperature in like a ice bath for over like 90 minutes, where he has a breathing technique that he uses and a couple other things that he does, and it's a thought process of getting in touch with your body and being able to control at a higher level what's going on.
Wow.
He can actually raise his body temperature, his core temperature, after being in an ice bath for an hour. He has climbed Mount Everest in a pair of shorts. He can do crazy
That's
things.
absurd.
There,
That's
for
amazing.
anybody that wants to read on him, if you just Google Wim Hof, all his accomplishments come up, and he's been a very polarizing figure on a scientific front, because he's done some things even as far as strengthening your immune system and things like that. To me, it all sounded real crazy until I heard him. I actually heard him on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Yeah.
He was on there and he talked and explained this whole thing. And it's something that I started to mess around with. UFC fighters, he works with a lot of fighters. A problem in a fight is that you get this adrenaline spike, and even though you've been training for years on how to do this, now you have this adrenaline spike and your brain has a hard time processing. Same thing happens in a deer hunting situation. You get this adrenaline spike. Yes, you shot at a target for months now and you can pinwheel it every time. You get that adrenaline spike, you almost damn near black out. And it's a completely different thing. Well, with this guy's breathing techniques, you can actually help to control that. And it works. It's been quite an amazing thing for me that I witnessed last year. Prior to last year's season, I've been guilty of, over the course of time, wounding some deer, and it happens. And let's say as a hunter, it's going to happen to me again at some point. But I
Sure.
wanted to do everything it just frustrates the hell out of me. I want to do everything my part to avoid that. And this year, and it could be coincidental, I shot 2 deer. I did not track any deer. Both were perfectly placed shots, and one was in kind of a higher stressed situation. And I personally think there's something to it, and there's something to gain from deer hunters by looking up Wim Hof, and for your overall health too. But I just couldn't believe, like, I found this little thing that translated into how to deal with that adrenaline spike, and it seems to work for me.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I got homework to do now. I gotta look this guy up and read up about that. That I've not heard of this, and now I'm really intrigued by it.
He has blown apart a lot of theories and things about how your immune system works, and actually how much more control you can have over your brain, and how that carries through your whole body, how you can control certain things of the human body that they never thought possible. He climbed Mount Everest in shorts. You'd think you'd be dead.
That's
Here's
absurd.
here's a bigger accomplishment than that he has. He's trained people to do this, and they've climbed Mount Everest in shorts.
Wow.
So it works.
Wow.
It's scientifically backed. They're trying everything they can to debunk this guy, and they're failing at a high level.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. No, I've got to look this guy up. I'll probably be looking him up within the hour after we're done. 'Cause
yeah, he's a fascinating human being.
that sounds incredible. Yeah, I'd really like to hear
Yeah,
more about that.
yeah, and a good way to check him out too is if you just Google the Joe Rogan podcast Wim Hof, you can listen to him talk and explain the whole thing. And once you go YouTube video, I mean, as soon as you put his name in, there's a lot of access to the information. Those two things have worked for me. That, and in the hunting season specifically, I've tried my part to eliminate sugar out of my diet and do growing up, this is pretty far off topic, but
That's all right.
it's just a detailed thing about the kind of different bits and pieces that I've put together that seem to work for me is I don't know if you're familiar with the ketogenic diet. So growing up, we were always taught to stay away from foods with a lot of fat in them.
Yeah.
And it turns out it's complete BS.
Yeah.
Sugar is really, you're only storing fat in your body because your body's so busy burning the massive amount of sugar that
Yep.
we consume. And so if you eliminate sugar out of your diet, your body and your brain functions start to work at a level that I never experienced before. Two big benefits for me in the deer woods is that, and I say deer woods. My wife just knocked me yesterday. She said, why don't you say woods? Why don't you say deer woods? I don't know. They're the woods that have deer in them, and that's why I'm there.
I get it. Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah. So the two big things for me was it seems like my brain works better because a lot of your neurological development and hormonal development is sourced from fat.
Yeah.
And another thing is that it's you get the peaks and valleys of a carbohydrate-based diet. You're full for a while, and then pretty shortly after you're full, there's a period where you're comfortable, and then not very long after that, you're hungry. And if you're trying to sit out in the woods for a 4-hour stint, you're full, and then for a little bit you're comfortable, and especially if it's cold, you're burning calories real quick. I get hungry to a point where it's like, I'm going to go in.
Yeah.
And I found that I can sit longer because I have more of a consistent, when fat is just a slower burning food. And it's just something interesting that I found translates into deer hunting.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I mean, I'm certain you're probably a lot younger than I am, but I hope you're not offended if I say we're probably in the same generation.
Yeah, no, we are.
So,
I'll be 34 here pretty quick.
yeah. And I'm 39. So,
Okay.
yeah. But yeah, no, we had the same thing. You know, I remember specifically growing up, you know, you gravitate, or your parents are giving you this stuff, low fat, no fat, you know, and it's because fat's bad for you.
Right.
But meanwhile, the analogy that I've learned at now that I'm a parent, you know, low fat, no fat usually mean it's pumped full of artificial kind of chemically type stuff, and it's not.
Right.
I notice a huge difference with my children when I feed them these sort of, you know, weird things. But when you try to get them some sort of pure, more organic protein type thing, they're way more mellowed out.
Right.
You know, they don't get these weird sugar rushes. And
Right.
I've never really, you know, even today, you know, I guess I still don't try to translate it into how it affects performance, especially on a deer stand. But I think there's a lot of validity to what you're saying with it. And I don't claim to be qualified to talk about nutrition at all.
Right. I barely am. I just know what works for me.
Yeah. And that's all you can do. Yeah. Yeah. And I've noticed, you know, since trying to make conscious efforts now, like if you're hungry and on the road, like, you know, you stop into a convenience store, you know, whereas before you'd grab like, you know, a little cake or donut type thing. Now I try to really focus on buying like beef jerky or something, you know, something that's got more protein based.
Right. It's tough to do.
It's tough to do.
Super tough to do. Even
Yeah.
some of that beef jerky, you look at it, and the bag will be 3 servings, which I'm going to eat the whole thing.
Oh yeah,
unquestionably.
It's gone in 10 minutes.
They weigh it down. It says it's 3.5 servings in each serving because they soak that stuff in brine before they make it.
Yep.
That little bag has 21 grams of sugar,
Yeah.
which I think for an adult male is something in between like 25 and 50 grams of sugar is
Yep.
what's recommended, and that's a bag of beef jerky.
Yeah. Yeah, you're done. You're done for the day.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
tough.
just I'm a little bit passionate about it. I lost a bunch of weight through this guy. His name's Mark Sisson, and he created a diet called the Primal Blueprint. And it's similar to a paleo-based diet where you're eating wholer, more natural foods, but you're focusing your main energy source. You eliminate carbohydrates, and you have a high-fat diet.
Yeah.
And so I increased my fat intake and set my sugar aside, and I can't believe what a change it was for me.
Yeah.
And the whole primal thing, you know, hunting is a very primal thing. and I just saw it translate into, like, my brain seemed to work better in high pressure situations
Right.
because it has the components that it needs to do what it needs to do.
That's pretty cool though that even you from at a personal level are noticing differences from like nutrition to performance, and you're making a connection.
Yeah, I'm past go to the gym to have a six pack and post. No one's going to my Instagram account to see my biceps. Like, that's not the point of it for me. The point of it for me is to be able to function better day to day, and I want to be able to deer hunt when I'm 60.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm overweight and deteriorating my health.
Yeah. Well, I think as you get older, you start noticing these changes that happen.
Yeah.
Like I can't eat pizza anymore after like probably 7 o'clock at night. I get crazy heartburn every time.
Yeah.
And when I was like 25, man, I could eat a pizza at 11 o'clock at night and not even have to
Not
worry
even
about
blink.
it. Yeah. So I think as you get older, you've got to take better care of your body, and I think it's kind of exciting time that the nutrition, health, fitness craze is being I don't want to say taken advantage of, but it's being recognized
Yeah.
from the outdoor sportsman's arena. So
It's a good, positive thing, especially for younger people. And people will go
absolutely.
back and forth. I mean, some people are already burnt out,
Well, and
on hearing about it. And they say, well, you don't have to be in shape to hunt. Certainly you don't.
no,
But
but it certainly helps. And I mean, let's face it. When I don't know, maybe you weren't like this. When I was like 15, 16, I wanted to be like a pro athlete. Well, that doesn't happen. So, you get into nutrition or health or fitness because you think it's going to help you move on. But, let's face it, not many of us are going to be like that. But every one of us can be a hunter. So you can take advantage of nutrition and fitness and use it to exploit and be a better, outdoor recreationist. And I think that's something that everybody can relate to.
yeah, you just said heartburn, and it could be completely coincidental. There's like no science to back it up. But when I eliminated sugar, I was dealing with some bad heartburn. I was taking a prescription pill every day.
Yeah.
Since I changed my diet and started doing that primal blueprint, my heartburn's gone.
Wow.
And I read on those heartburn pills that they're terrible for your liver.
Oh.
The stuff that you take daily.
Yep.
And it says right on, even on the bottle, this is not intended for long-term use. Well, if you've never dealt with heartburn, oh my gosh, man. And it was just
Yeah.
a daily thing for me. And I don't know if it's coincidental or what happened, but my heartburn went away.
It's probably a cause relationship there.
Sugar
So,
thing, I'm
yeah.
assuming.
Yeah. Whatever's working now for you seems to be working
Yeah,
better. So,
it's the only diet plan too that I've ever been able to just stick to
yeah.
because I eat a lot of wild game and
That's a big part of it, right? I mean, nobody wants to get on a diet that they don't like
make
what
you
they're
miserable.
eating. Yeah. So
That's why, yeah.
there's a quality of life component there.
Let's get I know I've kept you for quite a while. Is there anything that you personally want to take the opportunity to talk about as far as, like, it could be the state of Michigan, deer hunting in general, like through your eyes as a biologist, what is maybe something that guys deer hunting could pick up from you that you've kind of seen or experienced?
Yeah. That's a good question. If I would say one thing, and this is now biologist me talking, this, because before I was biologist me, I was just hunter me,
Yeah.
and hunter me had no clue about this sort of thing, is to really try to get a grasp of how your state operates and how like regulations are made type thing, because it's really easy to fall into the trap of, you're walking through, your local super center or whatever, and you pick up the deer hunting guide or the hunting and trapping digest or whatever you want, and you open it up and there's a change in there that's happened, or there's something's occurred that you don't like. There's something different that you don't like. That change came about probably months and months in advance of that. and chances are there was a public opportunity to provide your input on that. So if there's one thing I'd say is, if you're passionate about, deer hunting, hunting in general, just whatever, be informed and don't be apathetic towards it, and chances are anybody that's like downloading a podcast is going to be pretty passionate about it. But
yeah, certainly.
Don't be apathetic about it. Understand how the regulations are made. The other thing is, deer hunters kind of have a nasty habit of dividing themselves.
Big time. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, there's always we don't, too many times I don't think we look at each other and focus on our similarities. We focus on our differences. You're a bow hunter, I'm a crossbow hunter. You're a trophy hunter, I'm a meat hunter.
Your camouflage is different brand than mine. I don't like you.
It just doesn't matter. Yeah. and when we divide ourselves, we make ourselves smaller, and we're already making ourselves smaller in total numbers. So, the key thing is to try to unify the deer hunters in either the state or this country, so we have a powerful voice, and that the stuff that we are passionate about, when things come up that attacks that passion, we're unified, and people recognize that and listen to it.
Right. And to add to that, that doesn't even stop at deer hunting. It's been a huge thing for me this year. I joined Pheasants Forever. Not a pheasant hunter, but the pheasants and deer habitat is very similar. They like a lot of the same stuff.
Totally.
And I'm not a duck hunter either. And younger me, I live on the backside of the St. John's Marsh in St. Clair Flats. Everybody duck hunts.
Yeah.
When everybody starts duck hunting, the woods gets really loud. Deer get kicked around. I used to get relatively irritated with all the duck hunting. Well, now in the bigger picture, I've come to realize how much duck hunters do for conservation efforts. And they're on my team too.
Yeah.
So I can look past that now and not have a division line from duck hunting to deer hunting. Those guys are on my side too.
Yeah. If you're it doesn't matter what conservation and there's a lot of really good conservation organizations out there, but try to support at least one. And you don't, like you said, you don't even have to participate in the activity. One of the best things you can do is to buy a federal duck stamp.
Yeah.
Almost all that money goes back into conservation. Actually, I think it's 100%. It all goes back in, and even if you're not a duck hunter, that those organizations are working to protect land, protect habitat, whatever. That is going to have some sort of indirect measure and impact on your activity. So
right. What are some of your the top your favorite conservation groups here in the state, and then nationwide, and groups that people could look into?
Yeah. So you mentioned Pheasants Forever is a great one. I mean, they're focused on habitat.
I'm so impressed with them.
They're really good. Pheasants Forever is fantastic. I've got a shirt on now, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Yes, you do. A nice shirt. I complimented you on it before we started.
I'm jealous of yours as well.
This is a gentleman by the name of Dan Johnson. He does a podcast, Nine Finger Chronicles, and he made the shirt, and he donated all of his profits of the shirt, and then his sponsors that sponsor his podcast matched his donation, and they donated all the money to the NDA, the National Deer Alliance.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I like how it's just right up front. Like, listen,
yeah,
everything went to conservation on this, and that's why I'm wearing it. So,
yeah,
boom.
It was a no-brainer to purchase that.
Yeah. So, National Deer Alliance obviously is kind of and that one's just free to join. I mean, you can just sign up for it. And they're kind of young; they're getting started. I've had so many positive interactions with like Quality Deer Management Association. They're tremendous advocates for states and hunters in states. They speak out against bad legislation that would impact deer hunters.
Mm-hmm.
So I always Highlight them. Rough Grouse Society, American Woodcock Society. I mean, there's
Endless.
Ducks Unlimited. I mean, there's a mess of them, and there's a bunch of them out there that I'm not even mentioning right now off the top of my head because they're escaping me. But
Right.
any of those are really, really good organizations to throw your money and support behind.
And I joined this year too, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and that's a great group.
Great group. Yep.
I had our chairman from the state of Michigan over last night. It'll be the podcast that's out before this one, so people will have already heard it by the time they hear this. But that's just a great group of people, and it's not even all hunters. It's an even bigger picture outside the scope that we were just saying: pheasant hunters, duck hunters, deer hunters. Well, this group incorporates people that like to canoe and hike and camp and all different hunters of,
Yeah.
great group.
Yeah, I'm just starting to familiarize myself with them, but everything I've heard about them has been nothing short of impressive. So
Yeah.
I'd recommend them too.
Good deal. Anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up?
No, this was a lot of fun. We could probably go on for another hour
Oh,
or two.
we absolutely could. And if I didn't have some commitments later this afternoon, and I got to call my wife now and tell her my truck's all smashed up and deal with that mess. I'm surprised. My phone's been going off, and I should look. It's probably the police trying to contact me to get an accident report, so I do have some other business to handle.
Yeah, no, I'll let you go because it's been an eventful day for you.
Well, we'll do this. We'll get the opportunity to do this again.
Yeah,
one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing this is to give guys like you the ability to have a platform to get this kind of information. We're living in a world right now where science and facts are becoming like opinions.
Yeah.
And it's driving me nuts.
Yeah, I think science is being minimized a lot. I won't get political or anything because this is happening across multiple fronts, but yeah, science tends to take a backseat to opinions. I have some strong feelings about that as a biologist who based his career on science. So.
Yeah, it's a whole nother episode.
It sure is.
Maybe we'll talk afterwards about coordinating it because we'll be talking for another 2 hours if we start going down that road.
That'll just keep going.
Because I'm on the same page as you are. There's a lot of things on the political front right now that are just boggling my mind.
Sure.
But good deal. Michigan DNR. People, a lot of changes this year. They have a good website people can go to see.
Yeah, just simply go to mi.gov/DNR. That's our main DNR page, and then we have specific stuff that our communications department does a really good job. So you can go to mi.gov/deer.
Awesome.
mi.gov/CWD if you want more information from CWD. So, and then again, from an activist standpoint, mi.gov/NRC, which stands for Natural Resources Commission, just so people are more in tune and engaged with some of the regulations that are being either proposed or coming forward. It's a really good website to see what's happening sort of from the deliberation or regulation standpoint.
Right. I will, when I release this episode, I'll do a blog post on it.
Sweet.
And I'll share that to Facebook, and I'll have all those links in it. And then I'll also include all the links to all the conservation groups that we mentioned and talked about. So anybody that listens to this that is interested, you can go to deerhunterpodcast.com, and all that information will be there. The Deer Hunter Podcast on Facebook, and then I also have an Instagram page. It's at Deer Hunter Podcast, and anybody that's enjoying the podcast, do me a huge favor, share it, and go to iTunes, leave us a ranking or review. And last thing, I just want to say thanks a lot, Chad, for taking the time to do this. I've been it's been hard to coordinate with both our schedules, but we finally made it happen, and I'm really appreciative you took the time to do this for me.
Yeah,
so.
No, I appreciate you extending the invitation. I'm happy to do it, and I just wish that the events leading up to this were less eventful.
That's how it goes. It's just on a scale, like we said earlier. Nobody got hurt, and I'm going to be getting a new truck sooner than I anticipated. So we'll do it again, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Chad.